The next speaker is Steve Isaac. Luckily, the R&A under Sir Michael Banalek's leadership had the foresight to persuade Jim Arthur to write down his philosophy of greenkeeping, and they published Practical Greenkeeping that became the Bible of greenkeeping in 1997. Jim subsequently updated it in 2003, and recently Steve Isaac arranged a reprint in 2014. Steve was an agronomist with the STRI for 18 years before joining the R&A in 2003. I would ask you to welcome Steve Isaac, the most senior person in the R&A on the golf course side, to talk to us about the relevance of Jim's ideas to the challenges of today.
Thank you, Lorne. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Gordon for setting things up so nicely. And I would say that I'm a continuation of the warm-up act. Firstly, before I start reading out quotes from Practical Greenkeeping, a quick show of hands. Who in this room has heard of Jim Arthur? That's going to make my life so much easier. Who has got a copy of Practical Greenkeeping? Oh, I may as well go home now, Lord. That's very good to hear. In some respects, in another respect, it's not so good, because this is supposed to be a sales pitch. So we're not going to sell many copies today. Never mind. When Lorne asked me to talk about practical greenkeeping and its relevance to greenkeeping today, I thought, well, how am I going to approach this? And I thought probably the best thing to do was actually to use the words of the man himself. So all I'm going to run through is a few slides with some quotes that I've taken from Practical Greenkeeping. And hopefully you'll all think they have as much relevance today as they had when Jim first wrote them. And I should say my own history with Jim. Although I met him a few times when I worked for STRI, most of my time with Jim was after I moved to the R&A. And after the first couple of months of my new post at the R&A, I got the impression that Peter Dawson only employed me to fob off Jim. Because religiously at 10 o'clock every Monday morning, there'd be a phone call coming through to the R&A from Mr. Jim Arthur. And before I arrived, they went to Peter Dawson. After I arrived, they came straight through to me. And Jim always wanted to put the world's turf and turf management issues to rights in the hour or so that we spent talking every Monday morning. So, let's get on with Practical Greenkeeping. Commissioned by the Royal and Ancient Golf Club of St Andrews. It was first published in 1997, so we are now 20 years on. And a lot of Jim's theories stemmed from decades before that. So we're looking at theories that have been around for a long time. So surely, with new technologies, with lots of scientific thinking, we've moved on. Things must be different. We can't keep going the way we've always gone in terms of course management and greens management. Well, Practical Greenkeeping is now in its 3rd edition, and it's a regular seller from our website, so it must be saying something that's relevant to today's greenkeeping. So let's get on with the quotes from the great man himself. And it was a great exercise for me. In 2014, I went through Practical Greenkeeping with a fine-tooth comb because we felt we had to update it, particularly in terms of some references to chemicals that were on the market. And that was the primary reason for going through that review. We certainly didn't change anything that Jim said. We just brought those chemical references up to date. But there's lots of wisdom in that book. And the first bit of wisdom comes on page 18. Well, actually, there are 17 pages of wisdom before that. But this quote I pulled out, the principles of sound golf course management have never changed in over a century. I think that's a truism. They haven't changed. What the original greenkeepers on golf courses over a century ago were doing were the things that we should be doing now. Maybe we can do them more efficiently, maybe we can do them quicker, but they got it right. they worked with nature. As Gordon said, nature provides, and if we mess around with nature, then we're going to suffer the consequences. I don't suggest you go out and buy one of these mowers. That's a little antiquated. But the principle is exactly right. I don't know if you can see the quote there. I should have put that in black, so I'm going to have to read it out. The more golf courses cost does not mean the better they will be, or words to that effect. And this is an image of Ascanish Golf Club. And I don't know how many of you have heard Gordon speaking very passionately about Ascanish out in the Western Isles. But it's a golf course that was rediscovered, God, must be about 10 years ago now, Gordon. And it cost, I think, about £80,000 to rediscover it and bring it back to life. Now, you add at least a couple of noughts onto that, and you've probably got the cost of most new golf courses today. Very few of them will match the quality of playing that you'll see out in Ascanish. It is truly a natural gem. And if you haven't been out there, I strongly recommend you do. Bounce and run are vital dimensions of the traditional game. I think that's very much a truism. And the technical brains in this room couldn't get this short video to run from the presentation. So my friend here is going to run it separately just to show you what we mean by this. And this was back in Hoylake, 2006. I'm sure you all remember what we termed the golden fairways at Hoylake back in 2006. I think it was the epitome of the running game, won by Tiger Woods, who took driver off the tee on one occasion in 4 rounds. And that firmness, that ability to allow the golf ball to run across the turf is what today is all about. And every golf course can enjoy this type of golf, at least for part of the year. It's not just links courses, heathland golf courses that can be set up for the running game. Again, a universal truism in terms of golf course management. Drainage is still a far more important factor in relation to all year-round play than almost any other consideration. Drainage is the number one. If you haven't got decent drainage, you cannot produce decent playing surfaces, and you certainly cannot produce decent grasses. I'll qualify that. I remember going to one golf club up near Glasgow, and it didn't drain very well. And they had pure bent grass surfaces. The reason they had pure bent grass surfaces is that it was so wet through much of the year that they hardly had any play on the greens. If you want to get regular play off your golf course, and I think purely from a financial standpoint these days, it's absolutely essential. You have to get the drainage right. If you get the drainage right, then with sound management, going back to that first slide, everything else should come naturally. Colour is no measure of quality. Again, I think that's true to a point. If you allow colour to go too far and the grass starts dying, then potentially you've got issues in terms of quality. But we shouldn't be hung up on colour. Green is not always great. What suits farmers spoils courses. This is something that Jim came out with time and time again. Listen to farmers and do exactly the opposite on your golf course. Managing golf courses, particularly managing golf greens, we're not talking about yield. We're not after getting boxes and boxes of clippings off our putting surfaces. We want quality. We want grasses that grow relatively slowly, so they produce quality putting surfaces with minimal intervention. And it's interesting, Gordon mentioned growth regulators. We've gone so far to the other extreme. We now have to introduce another management technique to bring us back to produce slower growing grasses. World's gone mad. And still on that theme, the more one spends on fertilizers, the more one will have to spend on fungicides. I can see a few heads nodding in the audience. It's another truism. The more you spend on fertilizer, the greener the grass gets, the thirstier it's going to get, so you have to water it more. The more you water it, the more you'll leach the fertilizer out of the soil, the more fertilizer you think you're going to have to apply. It's a vicious circle. And as Gordon said, the grasses that we want to grow do not need bucket loads of fertilizer. Quite often, if you get your aeration right, if you get your top dressing right, those grasses will survive quite happily with the absolute minimum of nitrogen fertilizer input. That's not to say that we don't need a bit of nitrogen fertilizer. We are putting these grasses under a fair bit of stress. And I think there is a danger that we get into a competition to see how little nitrogen we can put on our greens. Bottom line for all greenkeepers is producing a quality surface at the end of the day. That's what you're employed for. So at times, you may have to apply a little bit of nitrogen. Again, Jim, there were lots of perceptions about Jim Arthur. And I think the worst one was that he went into golf clubs and he got greenkeepers into trouble because he told them not to apply any fertilizer or any water. Absolute nonsense. And I think this quote exemplifies what nonsense that was. It is a brave man who suddenly changes to restricted feeding with nitrogen only from a high NPK diet. Softly, softly is the answer to avoid the wrath of golfers being taken out on the greenkeeper. Pour on your turf, it's a drug addict. It's hooked on fertilizer and water. And like any drug addict, it will not perform at its best if you cut off that supply overnight. And it's not to say that you can't achieve that reduction while still presenting reasonable playing surfaces. And I think this is one of the great things that Gordon has done in his time at the golf clubs that he's listed previously, in that he's always focused, first of all, on the playing quality. And even through this process, you can still provide decent playing quality without sacrificing your principles. You can still get to your end goal. You may just have to be a little more realistic about how long a process that's going to be. I think Jim could be referred to as the Nostradamus of UK greenkeeping. Because as you read through practical greenkeeping, you come up with the odd quote like this: "The future of carbendazim, originally a fungicide with worm-killing side effects, is uncertain, but it'll probably go the way of the others. The prospect for greenkeepers is not appealing." Well, one thing that's great coming from this slide, we can say with some certainty that the future of carbendazim is assured. It's gone. We can no longer use it on our golf courses. And it's one of the first, well, not one of the first, I remember when we used to be able to use chlordane. And that was taken off the market probably about 20 years ago. Unfortunately, its residual effects probably wore out 10 years ago. And the effects for some greenkeepers will not be appealing if you have no control over casting worms. And another one. Pesticides are predictably going to be progressively banned or unavailable. 1997, this was written. How true were Jim's words from back in those days? Even truer The next bit of this sentence. So high input methods involving massive corrective or preventative chemical control systems will collapse. If you are reliant on chemicals to manage your turf, good luck. And I think this one, again, is very appropriate. I think this one was probably targeted at greenkeepers. The cause of problems almost always turn out to be due to errors of management. Now, quite often, that error of management has been forced on greenkeepers because of pressures from within the club. And we'll come up to having a go at some club officials in a slide or two's time. But in my agronomy days, a lot of the problems we saw were caused by poor greenkeeping decisions. Today we have vastly more qualified practical men, and clubs should, if they are so lucky as to employ such men, listen to them and give them responsibility. I think today we're blessed probably with more excellent greenkeepers than we ever have before. And if clubs only let them have the freedom to do what they know is right, than what they feel they have to do to present the type of surfaces that a lot of golfers want, then we'd see much more fine grass on our golf courses across the UK. To achieve results, we need an overall long-term management plan agreed by all and not subject to the whims of changing committees. Told you we'd get round to club officials eventually. And even better, this is the classic that everyone shouts out whenever Jim Arthur is mentioned. The best committees consist of an uneven number, and 3 is too many. For those who have difficulty with maths, that means that the best committee is made up of one person who can make decisions there and then. And to finish off on quotes from Jim's part of practical greenkeeping, traditional greenkeeping is emphatically not old-fashioned, nor is it out of date. I think we've heard from Gordon that the things that old Tom Morris was doing are the sort of things, in effect, that we are doing now. Things really haven't changed that much. We're still trying to produce the same grasses, hopefully, the same playing conditions. And I wanted to finish the quotes, not with something from Jim, but something from Sir Michael Banalek in his foreword. And I think this is very relevant to anyone who ever came across Jim Arthur. Invariably controversial, but infuriatingly nearly always right. Jim would take offense at that. He'd say, no, I was always right. Now, for those of you who are playing this afternoon, you've got a chance of winning a copy of Practical Greenkeeping. For those of you whose golf isn't up to scratch, you can always visit the R&A website and buy yourself a copy for £29.95 plus postage and packing. Right, Lorne, thank you very much indeed.